So in the month of May, I did all right. I did better than I expected, considering I went into the month knowing that I wouldn't have as much time as usual to read. And I did read slightly less than I typically do, but not really enough to make a significant difference. And the great thing about May is that I had not one, but 2 5-star reads, both of which are going to be, assumedly, because I don't expect to have a great deal of 5 stars between now and the end of the year with how slow they've been coming. So I do expect those 2 books to be on my best books of the year list come the end of 2024. So getting into my stats for the month, because we do have a very mixed bag. I read a total of 10 books, which added up to 3,581 pages, which broke down to an average of 116 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 3 2 stars, 2 3 stars, 3 4 stars and 2 5 stars, which is like an equal amount of really good and kind of average not so great reads. And these broke down to an average of 3.4 stars per book, which ain't too bad. For the demographics, I read 2 young adult and 8 adult books. For the formats, I read 9 standardly formatted novels, I listened to 2 audiobooks, and I read 1 comic. For the genres, this is where we have a real mixed bag, because I read 4 fantasy, 1 fantasy romance, 1 horror, 1 mystery, 1 romance, 1 science fiction, and 1 thriller. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, we once again have a mixed bag, because 5 of the books that I read were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2024. 2 of them are books that I've hauled in 2024. 2 were from the library, and 1 I read on Kindle Unlimited. And we are actually going to be starting off with that Kindle Unlimited read, because the first book that I read, technically I read it on the last day of April, but I'd already filmed my wrap up, so we're counting it for May. And that was volume 2 of the Die comic series, which is, I think volume 2 is called Split the Party. When I read volume 1, I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. It is about a tabletop RPG, so like similar to D&D, that this guy or teenager creates for his friend on his birthday. So this group of RPG players get together to play this game, and the dungeon master gives everyone a dice, and as they roll the dice, they get sucked into this fantastical world. So I think 2 years after that, they end up reappearing in the real world, and many years pass. Once again, it is our main character's birthday, and he receives a dice in the mail. So he gets the band back together again, and once again they are sucked into this fantasy world. Now, when they came back when they were teenagers, I think 6 of them went in, but only 5 returned, and the mystery of kind of like what happened to them and what happened to that other player is unraveled as we, as the reader, explore this fantasy world that the characters have ended up back in. So I really loved volume 1 because it did a really good job of establishing this world, getting us invested in the characters and kind of setting out the plot. I gave volume 2 4 stars. I do still think that it was very good. It was very immersive, very compelling. I think that the reason why this wasn't a 5-star read for me is that the plot is a little bit slower. This is only a 4-volume comic series, so I'm assuming that through these 2 middle volumes, they are going to be a little bit slower paced as we are drawing the plot to its conclusion in volume 4. I do really like that this does have a definitive end though, because it means that there's not as much dead space in it as you sometimes can find in comic and manga series. So overall, still really enjoyable. It didn't wow me like volume 1 did, but I'm still definitely going to be continuing. The next book that I read was a little bit of a disappointment, which is sad because this was a 5-star author for me previously, and that was Looking Glass Sound by Katrina Ward. So I did go into this one knowing that it was not Katrina Ward's best work. Like, I had been told that this wasn't as good as The Last House on Needless Street, which is what I read from Katrina Ward and gave 5 stars to. I did also listen to the audiobook for this, which is available on Everand, and I will say that the narrator is not a great one. There is a British girl in this book, like a British teenage girl, and the main character, who is male, and the narrator, who is male, does a terrible job of narrating this girl's accent. Like, it was literally painful to listen to. Now, the good news is that the part of the story where everybody is a teenager does not take up all of this book. It is, I would say, like the first third, but that accent, that terrible accent, does die out a little bit later in the novel, which I was so thankful for. But essentially, this is a adult thriller that is kind of convoluted, which is why I didn't love it. I gave it 2 stars. And it's following this boy whose uncle has a house on an island, and the uncle dies, so his family end up taking over this house and they're preparing it to sell. So this boy, like, I don't think he has very many friends, and he's on this island and he meets these two other kids that he is very drawn to, and he becomes part of their friendship group. Now on this island there is also a stalker called the Daggerman who takes photos of, I think it's just children in their beds, and leaves the Polaroids lying around for other people to find. So this story and like what happens on this island with these three teenagers really inspires our main character, who dreams of writing a book. So as he grows older, he does write this book, and as he goes into college, somebody starts to grow close to him and tries to steal this story from him, and he is then sent back to, or returns back to, the place where this story all started to try and set the record straight about what actually happened, because the person who stole this story from him has turned it into a sensational, like, horror type story. I enjoyed this to start off with. It was very much giving me the vibes of We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, with this group of kids like on this island, but you know that everything is not as it seems. I'm pretty sure it is an island. If it's not an island, it is on the edge of a cliff anyway. Like it's a cottage like overlooking the sea. I enjoyed the first bit, but this novel goes through different locations and different casts of characters as it progresses, and Katrina Ward, all I really expected from this is that there would be a lot of plot twists, because that is definitely what The Last House on Needless Street delivers. And yes, this does have a lot of plot twists, but instead of finding it masterful as I did with The Last House on Needless Street, I just felt like every plot twist in here was more and more convoluted till we got to the final one, and I was just like, is this a joke? Like, is this actually a joke? It's a type of book where when you get to the end, when you do like reveal the final plot twist, it's one that you kind of, if you enjoy it, you would want to go back, revisit the story, knowing what you know, and put in all the pieces into place. I do understand why some people like this book, but for me, it was just too convoluted. We have plot twists inside of plot twists. It made the whole thing pointless for me when I got to the end and kind of found out what was going on here. I will still read more from Katrina Ward. I think Sundial is one that I really want to read, but this was just not the one. Oof, something else that was not the one was Fire Study by Maria V. Snyder. This is the third book in the Study series, and man, did this series start great. And I cannot say that you did not warn me, because you did. But this series is following a woman called Yelena, who is about to be executed for the death of the son of a general. When her execution is coming up, she's pulled out of the dungeons by the advisor to the commander, and also the commander's assassin, who tells her that instead of being executed, she can become the commander's poison, like food tester, to test for poisons. So she obviously agrees, but things get complicated because the general whose son she's murdered does not feel like he has gotten his justice, and so she is constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next like threat to her life to appear. So book one kind of focuses on that plot line and that setting. Book two really opened the world up, and book three was just a hot mess. Like, I enjoyed book two, but I did feel like the ending was quite rushed, especially knowing that some of those plot threads were going to be further explored and wrap up eventually in book three. That was made so much worse when we got into book three, and it was just non-stop back-to-back action, like jumping from ambush to ambush, fight scene to fight scene, where nothing is really accomplished and always ends with the main character being knocked unconscious. Like, that is the only transition between battle scene and not battle scene, is this girl waking up. So I was not having the best time with this. I feel like part of the strength of the first book is that it was quite slow moving to really ground us in the story, get us introduced to the characters, the plot, the politics. And I feel like that kind of atmosphere was really lost by the time we got to the third book, because I just don't feel like it needed to be so action heavy, especially when so many of these fight scenes weren't really amounting to anything. I also feel like this did not come to a satisfactory conclusion for me. I feel like I wanted us to achieve a little bit more in terms of the politics of this world and like the things that the main character is trying to achieve. I wanted us to achieve a little bit more of that. Up until I started this book, I was going to continue on with this series. I was going to get the Fairy Loot set of the next Study books and also read the Glass series. After reading this, I have to be honest, I don't really have any desire to continue, which is such a shame because I had such high hopes for this series and it started off so so strong and just went steadily downhill from there. Content warnings in here as well for sexual assault. Books 1 and 2 had very graphic depictions of sexual assault, so be very cautious if you would like to read this series. This one focused on it a little bit less, but it is still mentioned pretty regularly. We then had a very surprising 5-star read, and my 2 5 stars for me are very, very different vibes. But the first one, and currently my best read of 2024, is A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. I know we are all shook here because this is book 8, 7, 8, right? If you include the short stories as a book, then this is book 8 in the First Law universe as a whole. And my journey with the First Law universe has truly been a journey. I really enjoyed the first trilogy. I didn't love any of the standalones. I hate short stories in general, and I didn't love the ones set in this world. So by the time I started this book, which is the first book in the Age of Madness series, I just assumed that I was going to hate it because I assumed that I didn't like Joe Abercrombie anymore. And this one really changed my mind. The plot of this one as a trilogy, I can't really explain because the thing about Joe Abercrombie's plots is that they're not like a very clear, this is what we're trying to achieve, or this is the problem that we're trying to solve. It's more like every little thread that has been established in every book that has come before this has played a very small but integral part in making the world what it is at the start of this series that our main characters now have to navigate. But the characters in this one are all related to characters that we have met earlier in the series. I want to say that this is set roughly 20 to 25-ish years, maybe slightly more than that, after the end of the first trilogy, and obviously a little bit less time has passed between this and the standalones. We are once again set in a world on the brink of war. However, the circumstances of the war are a little bit different than they were earlier on down the line, because while we do have some old foes that are like kind of rising up again and trying to seize control, we also have the industrial age and all of the issues that arise with that and have arisen with that in our history. So as on top of the fact that we have nations going to war, we also have a workers' revolution coming into play, and some of our main characters are part of the royal family, some are part of the nobility, and we are seeing their way of life kind of start to destabilize as we have a big power shift within the society and also the politics of the world. The thing that I really loved about this one that I find to be very different from any other book that we've read is that the characters in this one are not necessarily terrible people. And not all of the characters in First Law are, but I will say that they are all extremely flawed. And so if you pick a favorite character, you're saying, I love this character, but they have done this terrible thing. A lot of the characters in here are young. A lot of them have really only known peacetime. And so while they do have their character flaws, while some of them are ignorant and privileged, while some of them have been coddled, they're not inherently terrible people. And the difference that that makes is that I can now root for these characters, which is not good. It is not good because Joe Abercrombie books always end on a sad note. They are bittersweet at the best. And knowing what I know about Joe Abercrombie, it is dangerous to root for these characters because they're either going to spiral into terrible people or they're going to end up dead or something awful is going to happen to them by the end of this series. Once again, I do see the parallels between First Law and Game of Thrones, and while I gave this 5 stars and while I love it, I will always say about the First Law universe, it's like Joe Abercrombie broke Game of Thrones down into all of its individual plots, like character archetypes and tropes, put it all into a bag, shook it up, picked everything out at random and wove it together kind of in a different pattern, and that is especially evident, I feel, in this one. That being said, I thoroughly enjoyed it and I'm really excited to see where the next book takes it. One that I sadly didn't love quite as much was Knock Knock Open Wide by Neil Sharpson. This one is an adult horror that I picked up because I co-hosted Jordaline from Jordaline Reads Patreon book club for the month of April, but the live show was in May, and I feel like this one started off strong, but the more that it continued, the kind of less interested in the story I was. So this one is following a woman called, I think it's pronounced Attain, and she is going to her sister's party. She's gone to her sister's party where she's meeting up with her boyfriend that she hasn't spoken to for a while because she kind of has commitment issues because of her relationship with her mother. So she goes there and her boyfriend proposes with this ugly ring. She accepts, and she has to be back in the city to go to work the following day. So she starts to drive home through the countryside at like 4 in the morning, and she ends up finding this dead body on the side of the road. So being a person possessing a good conscience, she drags this body into the back of her car and tries to find help. She takes the body to a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere where the people who own it are actually expecting her somehow, and she spends the next few days or few weeks there. To the outside world, she has gone missing and everybody is frantically searching for her. So that one is the past timeline. In the present timeline, we are following a student called Betty who is falling in love with a dark and mysterious girl called Aisling. Now, the closer that Betty gets to Aisling, the more that she finds out about Aisling's mysterious family and some dark and murky things that have potentially happened in Aisling's past, because Aisling is actually Atane's daughter and everything traces back to this time period when Atane went missing and nobody really knows what happened to her. So the beginning of this one was so spooky, it was so creepy, and I loved the atmosphere that was created. I definitely gelled with the past timeline and what was happening there and what originally happened to Atane more than I gelled with the modern day timeline, because I felt like the past really dealt with some of the horror elements and then the present timeline was dealing with more contemporary issues, and I feel like with the amount of space the present day timeline took up within this story, I was just getting kind of bored with it. My main criticism of this book, or the main thing that I didn't like about it, is that when you discuss this book, which obviously I did because it was for a book club, the more you kind of don't really understand what has happened. Like, there's no real explanation for some things. Even though it's not necessarily that kind of horror, it is a little bit weird, it is a little bit ambiguous, but there is a moment where everything kind of comes to a head and you get a lot of answers about a lot of things. But when you really break this book apart and you think, why did this happen? Who was this person? Why did this person exist only for this to happen to them? The whole thing kind of falls apart, and that's what I didn't really love about it. Atmospherically, I did think that it was decent. I enjoyed the folklore that was woven throughout this, but overall, like, it was kind of forgettable, and I did find that it disappointed me in the end. My other 5-star read, very different vibes. This one is a YA fantasy romance. I would personally say it's more new adult than YA. Like, it's not YA, but it's also like feels a little bit older as well. And that one is The Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli. So this one is the first book in a duology, and it is following a young woman who is a witch. And 2 years prior to the start of this story, there was an uprising where all of the witches were killed. So she had to turn over her own grandmother. Her grandmother agreed to it. It's not like she went behind her grandmother's back, because they'd already received a tip that her grandmother was a witch, and if she didn't turn her in, she also would have been killed for being an accomplice and like hiding a witch. After her grandmother was executed, she found out that she herself was a witch, and so she has spent the last 2 years trying to rescue witches that are about to be executed. She takes them from prisons, she sends them away, and she frees them, and she is known to, what are they called? Is it the Witch Guard? It just calls him a witch hunter, but she is known to the captain of the witch hunters as the Crimson Moth. She's almost like this notorious Robin Hood kind of figure. Our male main character, Gideon, the captain of the witch hunters, is constantly trying to hunt down our main character, but he has no idea who she is, and she hides in plain sight pretending to be a vapid socialite, while in the background she is saving all of these women from execution. This story starts off where Ruin is trying to save a woman called Seraphine, who was a close confidant of her grandmother's and also tied to the witch queens that were overthrown like during this revolution. And she arrives just after the witch hunters have taken Seraphine into custody. So she is spending this book trying to find out information to get to Seraphine before she is executed. So to gain that information, she starts cozying up to Gideon, knowing that he is the captain of the witch hunters and the one that arrested Seraphine. On the flip side of that, Gideon is also cozying up to Rune because he suspects that she is the Crimson Moth, and the closer that he can get to her, the more he can find out about whether that is true. Of course, not everything goes as simply as intended, and while these two are fake dating, they start to fall for each other for real. So this is made even more complicated by the fact that Gideon's younger brother is in love with Rune. He's Rune's best friend and she's kind of oblivious to it, but to everyone else outside of this, it's really obvious that he's just waiting for Rune to kind of wake up and realize and like see that he's there. So Gideon is also feeling intense guilt about this, but he feels like he's doing it for the good of the realm if Rune does indeed turn out to be the Crimson Moth. So this one started out in a very like cliche, typical YA fantasy fashion. Think like 2015 to 2018. It was pretty much like something that I'd read a million times before, but as I got closer to the characters, as we learned a little bit more about them, as the romance started to develop, I started to get more and more invested in this. Gideon is a character that I am a sucker for. He is this like attractive, powerful man that, because of his background, always assumes that he is not good enough, and he sees this socialite that he actually has no interest in anyway because he thinks that she's about as deep as a puddle. And as he starts to learn that she isn't, he starts to think of all of the ways that he isn't good enough, about how he's gonna have to step back because his brother is in love with her, and all of that good stuff that I just die for. On the flip side of that, Rune is falling for Gideon, but she knows that she is a witch, and if he ever finds out the truth about her, he is going to execute her because he has a lot of trauma in his past that means that he will never ever trust witches. Something that I did really love about this story as well is that it does portray like domestic abuse and sexual assault with a male victim, and not in a way that ever emasculates the victim at all or portrays them to be weak for being vulnerable to this. And I really loved that about this book. I also really loved that part of the love language of these two main characters is that they gift each other clothes, and that's all I'm gonna say because I'm not gonna ruin the specifics, but I also really enjoyed that element of it, and I'm really excited to get to the sequel. Content warnings in here, as well as like the abuse, the sexual assault, the torture, the execution. The way that the witches use magic in this world is by drawing blood, so there are instances of things like cutting and self-harm because the witches create cuts and scars on their body to draw blood to harness that magic. Another 4-star read was of course book 3 in the Pretty Little Liars series by Sarah Shepherd. This one is perfect. It's called perfect. It wasn't perfect, otherwise it would have been 5 stars. But this one is a YA mystery series following a group of girls whose friend went missing, and they start to receive ominous text messages threatening to uncover their deepest, darkest secrets, signed by a mysterious figure called A. So these girls have kind of drifted apart over the last couple of years, and they start to come back together to get to the bottom of who it is that is blackmailing them. This is, I've said it before because I've been reading one of these a month, and I'm going to continue to read one of them a month, so I'm going to keep this brief because nothing really has changed, but there are so many like content warnings and red flags in here. This is a perfect representation of life, or not even life actually, it's a perfect representation of media that was aimed at teenage girls in the early 2000s, and as I was a teenage girl in the early 2000s, I love it for that because it feels so nostalgic to me. But it also has tons of stuff like romanticizing a teacher-student relationship, older male characters, relationships romanticized with teenage girls. There's like fat shaming, slut shaming, all of that stuff, but it's just so entertaining, and it's not badly written, which I really assumed that this series was going to be. It's not. It's super compelling, super angsty, and I'm having a really great time with this one. So I gave book 3 4 stars. This one was better than book 2 as well, which I did enjoy, but it felt like a little bit of a decrease in quality from book 1, and book 3 has took it back up. I also finished listening to the audiobook of Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel, which I have to say, this was a 5-star prediction for me. I don't know if it was ever on any official list, but I definitely thought that I was going to give this 5 stars. I listened to the audiobook because this is a, I don't know if the full series is, book 1 is definitely told all in transcripts, and the audiobook is like a full cast narration. So that's the route that I decided to take, and it was definitely a good idea. So this one is essentially about a giant robot. It starts with a girl who is riding her new bike, and she falls in this crack in the ground and lands in a giant robot hand. And from then on, like scientists, the government, whole groups of official type people are trying to find all of the pieces of this robot and assemble it. So this is following this mysterious overseer figure who is putting together this group of very skilled scientists, pilots, engineers to find all of the pieces of this robot, reassemble it, find out why it was created, where it came from, how all of these pieces ended up buried under the earth, and all of that good stuff. So along the way, things happen personally within the the members of this team's life and like their everyday drama is depicted in here, but also as they learn more and more about this thing, as they unlock more and more of its abilities, things start to go very wrong on a larger scale, because this is, I don't know if it is a government operation. They're very cagey, as government operations often are, about who is the person behind all of this, but there's lots of things like accidents, cover-ups, and while we're gaining more and more information about this robot, we're also unlocking more and more mysteries as this story goes on. So I really enjoyed the listening experience of this. It's definitely entertaining to listen to. I think that I would recommend listening to it because there are lots of elements of this that are kind of repetitive. The overseer figure is constantly posturing as he introduces himself to new people, and he tells them that they will do what he says, otherwise there will be trouble, and he'll make sure that they regret not complying for the rest of their life. And that kind of theme is recurring throughout here, and I feel like that could get very tedious if you're trying to read this like physically. I didn't really like the point that this built up to, and I also don't feel like I learned as much about this robot and where this series is going as I would have liked to from a first installment. So overall it was very entertaining. I really enjoyed it, but it's not the mind-blowing experience, the mind-blowing story that I kind of assumed that it was going to be. But I am very excited to go into the later books in this series and hopefully learn a little bit more about what the point of the series is, because we did answer a lot of questions in this book, but I don't understand what the point of this series is. Like, why am I reading this story? That's what I need to find out from the sequels. I then picked up a book that I still don't really know what I think about, which is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshani Chokshi. This is a standalone gothic fantasy about a man who is only known as the bridegroom, who marries this beautiful, enigmatic, mysterious woman called Indigo. And when they get married, she says that she will love him providing that he never delves into her past. So he promises to, up until her aunt is dying, so she is called back to the place where she grew up. And as he enters this house, the house itself has a presence. It's not explained, it is ambiguous in that regard, but the house has a presence, and the house starts whispering to him. And between the house and speaking to this elderly aunt that is dying, he figures out that his wife Indigo had a best friend called Azure who mysteriously went missing, and the house and the aunt would like him to get to the bottom of what happened there. However, doing so will break his wife's explicit request not to dig into her past. So while we're following his timeline in the present day, we're also following Azure's timeline, who is the friend that went missing, from the day that she first met Indigo up until her disappearance. I really enjoyed the writing in here. It is very flowery. Sometimes I did feel like it was so flowery that we were kind of losing the content and the point, but it is definitely there to build and create atmosphere, and I do think that that is definitely achieved. My main kind of issue and why I don't really know what to think about this book is that one, actually there's two. The first one is that I guessed the plot twist less than 50 pages into this, and I don't know, because it's more about the how, I feel, but am I only saying that because I knew what the what was really early on, that I only had the how to appreciate? Like, is the plot twist supposed to blow your mind? I don't know, because it didn't blow mine. But the other thing is that I was quite bored throughout my reading experience of this. Up until I want to say the last 80 pages, it's like a 280 page book. My intrigue really ramped up in those last 80 pages as we were building to the climax and kind of unraveling what was going on here. But up until then, I thought that it was very meandering, and while it was atmospheric, while it was interesting, I don't feel like I was as drawn into this as I could have been, if that makes sense. Now, the way that this ends is why I am focused so much on the how of this. Like, is this book about the how and the why, not the what? And in hindsight, this book is a lot better than it was when I was reading it. So I gave it 3 stars. But I didn't unhaul it because this was for shelve it or scrap it, because I feel like it's a book that you think about, and I have been thinking about it. But did I enjoy it? I don't know. I don't know. There's also a fantastical element in here where Indigo and Azure they call each other like soul sisters, and they are trying to ascend into the realm of the Fae. And it reminded me a lot of The Furies by Katie Lowe, where you're not sure how real the fantastical element is. Like, does it actually exist, or is it kind of like the hysteria created by these two girls who only really interact with each other, so they're building like a reality out of their own delusions, if that makes sense. And that was also interesting and something that I keep thinking about. So I gave it 3 stars. I don't know if I liked it or not, but I think about it a lot and have thought about it a lot since I finished it. And then actually, no, I was gonna say that the last book that I read in May was one that I definitely didn't like, and I can't even say that for sure, if I'm being honest. It was Things We Never Get Over by Lucy Score, which was my Patreon pick for April. It took me so long to read this book. I do 100% think that this book is way too long. It's like almost 500 pages for a contemporary romance, and it is a small-town contemporary romance, and it is following a woman who was about to get married, and she received a call from her sister, her evil twin sister, asking for help. So she drives in her wedding dress to this town with a wad full of cash to give to her sister. She pulls up at the diner where she's supposed to meet her sister, and her car goes missing because her twin has just waited for her to arrive before she's run off with her like car and all of her money, and left our main character stranded in this small town with a niece that she didn't even know existed. Everyone thinks that she's her twin, and so she doesn't get the greatest response when she arrives in this town. And one of the first people that turns up to kind of put her in her place is the town bad boy, Knox Morgan. He is very much a loner. He doesn't believe in relationships or love. He's been burned in the past. He has a little bit of childhood trauma, as they always do. While he says that he's not interested in her, he's always around. They end up in like a fake dating kind of situation. It's also like has a little bit of crime thrown in. Like 200 pages of this book is small town contemporary romance, and then you get to page 200 and there's like an illegal gambling ring, a bunch of criminals from out of town, somebody gets shot, and somebody is wrapped up in like a string of petty thefts as like a career thief. It was just whiplash, you know? But the reason why I don't know how I feel about this is because I don't actually think that this was good. I thought that it was overly cheesy in the way where it could have been like a children's TV, like the setting of this could have been the setting of a children's TV show, because like you have people who work at the bar. Like one of them's called Five Fiasco. The guy who works at the diner is called Justice. Like they have these almost like cartoonish names, and some of it was very cheesy, some of it was very twee. Like all of the women that work at the bar have their periods synced, and when they're on their period it's known as Shark Week, and the boss brings them brownies and like avoids them. And just like bits like that I just really didn't appreciate. But it's almost like this book held me hostage, because the further I got into this, even though I actually didn't like the love interest, he reminded me a lot of the love interest from It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey, which I also didn't like that book very much. I found him to be a little bit overbearing, and I didn't like how he was constantly in the main character's space and kind of like physically intimidating her. There was something about it that I actually didn't hate. So at this point I'm now kind of torn about whether I want to read the sequel. I don't think it's going to be any great priority for me, and I'm actually not super excited about the romantic pairing that we're going to get in book 2, but I am very excited about the romantic pairing for book 3. So I might continue with this series in the future. I did get this one from my library. It's also available on KU though. And I was thinking about putting a hold on the sequel at the library because it feels low risk, you know, especially because there's a queue. So like I don't know at what point I'm gonna get it, but we also know that's a little bit of a toxic trait I have at the moment with library books. So maybe I won't, who knows? But this was a book that I read. I didn't think it was very good. I didn't hate it, so take from that what you will. So those were all of the books that I read in the month of May. It was definitely a pretty good reading month. We had some ups and downs, but we did have some 5-star reads, and these days that is the only thing that matters because I'm just so picky. But down in the comments, let me know what your favorite book of May was, and if you would like to leave me a little comment but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a flower emoji, specifically a daisy if possible. But if not, any flower will do. Aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram, Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Kindle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.